Thank you very much, John.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Chancellor, President of the Pontifical Academy, for inviting me today to talk to you and the privilege to share with you the ideas and some of the analysis that has come through my time here, but also looking at the United Kingdom's experience. The three papers from this morning's talk, Margaret, Pierpaolo, and Stefano, I think set the scene extremely well in mapping out the various issues that have to be addressed, including the culture of our society, the notion of trust and its loss, the role of contract, and also the question of a common good and whether that can be brought into existence through better economic analysis and better laws. At the heart of the analysis is evidence-based policy making. And it falls to me to ask a very simple question: has law a part to play in addressing and bringing forward a participative society? I fear my contribution will be more modest than the ones this morning, because I think the question is challenging in the extreme. Let me be clear why. The proud history of the United Kingdom as a rule of law society puts it at the apex of a country that developed industrially and then had to address issues relating to poverty, education, wealth, its redefinition, inequalities, and social exclusion. It also undertook some of the concerns about slavery, and it looked at the means of social ordering through law, through national legislation, as a way to redress the distribution of power inequalities in different groups. To say the least, that is a very high aspirational bar to set, and indeed my paper traces the development of those activities in the 19th century. We can point to public health, clean air, factory inspectors, employment law, innovative devices, and creativity in the development of different economic instruments. And even in more recent times, in the 1960s, we can look at the frameworks of anti-discriminatory legislation, including race relations, more recently the Equality Act. And you know, your optimism may be at its height when you remember that the intractable problem of Northern Ireland was addressed in 1998 with various attempts through the Anglo-Irish Agreement and the recrafting and redrawing of the constitutional architecture of the country to give minority rights where they no longer had, they didn't have them before. In fact, you could argue that it is the high point in our legal constitutional arrangements, because not only has the delivery of constitutional architecture and framework been applied in Northern Ireland, but we know in South Africa the ending of one-party dominance was accompanied by a new constitutional arrangement in 1996. And we also know in many African countries, Namibia, Angola, Mozambique, Uganda, Swaziland, and even Zimbabwe, there were attempts to bring together new constitutional arrangements, frameworks which would address the inequalities of our societies in those diverse communities. So the bar is made even higher when one interrogates the international arrangements. It is the case that the last century could be truly described as a moment in constitutional tinkering which would have the aspiration of a better world and a more equal society. I do not need to remind you of how disappointing it has all proved to be. And that disappointment is shared throughout those continents, but also with our own arrangements in the United Kingdom. In fact, dare I speak of the United Kingdom at all, because one of the challenges is that it is no longer united and it is no longer a single kingdom. There will no doubt be discussions about the differences between Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland in the future, but it will make it more difficult to deal with the issues of participation, which is at the heart of my discussion. I begin with the historical examples, not as a wonderful utopia upon which we could build a future, but simply the recognition of a moral order that combined a number of forces that I do not see present today in our society. We all know that lobbying is the success of the few and the enlightenment of the many. We know that the elite is very good at defining and redefining itself to be the winner. But in the framework that came about at the middle of the 19th century, a framework which I think was informed by the work of Austin and Bentham, Dicey and Leslie Stevens and John Stuart Mill, and dare I say it also drew in the work of Kant and the moral philosophy of the time, there was a sense of purpose, an optimism that national legislation would reform, renew, and create a better social contract. I dare not use the word social contract too heavily in the United Kingdom because it has connotations of a republic, namely the French Revolution, of which they are very, very concerned, even today, that it might be repeated. But nevertheless, I think my point is clear. Bentham, with all his faults and problems of minorities and majorities, nevertheless produced an analytical jurisprudence that in fact informed, and it grew from the continental model of von Savigny and others, who also looked at ideas and translating them into reality. For me, what I draw from this period is something more profound than the intellectual agenda. It is the fact that there was evidence-based science. That is a very important point to make in a modern world. Facts could be looked at through data, interrogated for truth and lies. And evidence was one of the key elements of bringing together disparate groups into collective decision-making that took science and law and economics and jurisprudence and moral philosophy into a mixture of thinking that made standards for society a common good. Why was it so successful? I think most of it is due to the fact that the statistical data that was collected could be interrogated by everyone. There was a visibility and transparency, as well as an understanding that is difficult to find today in the same way. But also, there was something very important. Groups of interested people, not necessarily politicized or political, were able to band together into statistical groups and societies to promote their disparate ideas, but at the end of the day, to bring them forward into legislation. It is interesting to reflect as to what the politicians were doing at the same time. And here there is a resonance with our present-day concerns. Most of the legislation that was passed came towards the middle and end of the 19th century. It is true that the electoral arrangements had favored, for the first time, a more representative population, a more representative member of parliament. But it's equally true that the politics of the day were caught up in a question of home rule and issues relating to the economy, not necessarily the issues relating to social justice. As the politicians were not necessarily united in what should happen, there was an opportunity for these different groups to bring together the moral imperative of legislation that would cure, if not remedy, social distress. And the flagships stem from the Sewage Acts in 1865, all the way through to Public Health in 1872, and then the Town and Country Planning Act and various parts of drug and food legislation. In other words, the welfare state did not begin after the Second World War. It was created by this mixture of developments, partly scientific, partly intellectual, partly philosophical, and partly economic. And it was based also on a coming together of, for the first time, the use of legislation. That's an important thing to remind you. If you look at the statute book, its previous incarnation was about bringing legislation to put into codified form that which the judges had already decided. for example, the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861 was simply a statutory form of common law rules created by the judges. Here was a new deal, quite literally. It was using law as a form of social engineering, as a form of trying to create a better society through the very process that had never been used in exactly that way before. I think it is fair to say that the law schools of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s were inebriated by the toxicity of this persuasive set of arguments. Betterment. Society could be improved. Our world could be made a better place. I can see in the writings of Ronald Dworkin, taking rights seriously, some of those ideas translated into a rights agenda, as well as into the profound thinking of the intellectual period of the time. And so it was that during the period after the Second World War, much legislation was passed dealing with the aftermath of industrialization and the rebuilding of Britain after the Second World War itself. Again, a moment that is defined not necessarily by the politicians, but for the necessity of having to address acute social problems in terms of housing, disposition, and poverty. In the 1960s, which is the second part of my discussion, we moved to a different agenda. It is quite clear that the settlement of rights and obligations had been imperfect. We had improved systems of regulation, and we had provided better social services and delivery. But we had not tackled at heart discrimination and the violence that might come from it. The Race Relations Act of 1965 and the various attempts to amend it and remodel it brought together a new set of rules about how we should treat each other in terms of some form of equality. Let me remind you of two things. While the United Kingdom is proudly a rule of law state, it lacks a written constitution. That's the first point. And the second point, there has been a reluctance to have rights at the heart of what we do. And that rights lack, or that absence of rights, has taken a long time to remedy. In fact, you would have thought in the 1970s it would have happened, but it didn't. It took a longer period of time for the Human Rights Act to be passed and to be brought into operation. And significantly, it does not apply to private or non-public bodies, which is itself significant about the nature of power and its allocation. Anyway, the rule of law continues to provide the bedrock of an unwritten constitution. And as you will see, I discuss some of the aspects of this in terms of Equality Acts of 2006 and 2010, which are accompanied by the creation of a commission to bring together rights in terms of disability, which we talked about yesterday, in terms of racial equality, and in terms of equal opportunities. Now, it's obvious that these attempts to solve social problems are driven by legislation that often mimics the experience of other countries, including the United States and some of the Commonwealth countries. It does not necessarily produce the outcome that people will hope for. Age, disability, gender, and all the various parts that make up our diffuse society remain sadly unequal, even though there are legal rights which would suggest that there would be a better opportunity. Take the area of employment. It's still the case that there is a gross disparity between the pay of women and men and the opportunities each have. The limitations of law and of national legislation is therefore a factor that has to be looked at if we come to deal with using legal rules and legislation to deal with participation. One example of this is the counteractive to creating more law, which is to be found in the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act of 2013. This suggests that government is overregulated, and therefore there is an intention to deregulate that part of government to free the individual so that they can make decisions outside the normal confines of law. And why has that happened? But because there is, in fact, a yawning gap between the expectations people have today and the political form of, if you like, dialogue between the political parties and individuals. There's a disconnect. Employment appeals, which were seen as a palliative for employment mistakes and errors and illegality, are now seen as a bad thing rather than a good thing. The Modern Slavery Act produces the optimism that those that have been trafficked and those that are subject to servitude and the awful societal position that it puts them in will be somehow remedied by a national referral mechanism. And yet that mechanism is simply words on the statute with little meaning or content. They are in exactly the position of having no particular rights, no recognition as citizenship, but simply a category which is as meaningless as the words are vague. In other words, the optimism of legislation, including equality acts and gender pay gap regulations, which is just one recent form of it, have given rise to an expectation that somehow or other national legislation will solve problems. I think it creates what I would describe as the architecture for the problems to be solved. It still leaves the solutions very much embedded in the way in which our society works. The pragmatic political action of the 19th and 20th century has shown us the potential that legislation has for creating real changes. And in the case of Northern Ireland, architecture that has created peace and a degree of tranquility unimagined in previous attempts to solve the problem. Let me not be too depressing. One of the great benefits of a parliamentary system is the collation of evidence and the collection of information. Legislation is not the gift of the government of the day. There are many ways that legislation can be passed through private members' bills, through special procedures, and so on. The process and procedures of our parliamentary system, including the opportunity to have e-petitions, the opportunity to lobby as individuals or groups, is, if you like, a higher possibility than ever before. So the parliamentary experience is not simply locked down by the political process of party. It is open to people to make their case and argue their cause. So although the experience of anti-discrimination legislation in Britain is disappointing, and although the mainstreaming of many of these rights and obligations into the national legal system is an example of what can be done through law to change attitudes, to prevent discrimination as much as to avoid it in the first place, nevertheless, it is still the case that it depends on the moral conscience that goes to the dignity of individuals. We live in a society where that dignity, I think, is still respected, but the core values which make it up have to be articulated more clearly and enunciated more simply. Put in another way, it is not selfishness, but self-centeredness. It is self-interest that has taken on a passive attitude to what the common good might mean. Let me be also clear that the challenge could not be any greater. When the 19th century example was cited, it was a unitary country in the sense that there was at least a UK Parliament that would make legislation for everyone. Now it is more complicated by the fact that legislative powers have been devolved to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and the Brexit, the Great Repeal Bill, suggests that there will be a preoccupation with the re-architecturing of the architecture that was put in place in the first place. My point being that I think the role of law and its various limitations will be used in order to bring forward that legislation, that is the Great Repeal Bill, the way in which we will operate outside the European Union. And it seems to me this is a moment of opportunity. a moment when we can collectively look at what it is a participatory society means. And as the government white paper admitted in 2012, and therefore long before the Brexit debate came up, participation, it says, requires changes to society, not changes to the law. A more integrated society, not just a job for government, it requires collective action across a wide range of issues at national and local levels by public bodies, private companies, and above all, civil society. There's a Localism Act, which reminds us that Britain is not a central state, but very much a delegated local central relations state, where a lot of powers are at a local level. Let me say that this is where I think the church has an enormous opportunity. Religious groupings at both local and community level may very easily be more persuasive than the national voice. And as they may form public opinion, they may confront at the bottom-up approach, which Margaret articulated so well, some of the issues that go to the future generations that may not have jobs or employment or opportunities, enriching our life by trying to make capacity not the economic tool, which it is, but a form of engagement, restoring the essence of what it is to be in a society, which is the trust, which must, in fact, inform the rule of law itself. So, to conclude, national legislation is possible. It is certainly likely to be used in all forms of ideas and proposals for a more participative society. But unless the legislative agenda is seized by the groups that are best able to inform it, it will not happen. Simply because the politics of the day and the parties of the moment are not engaged in this in the way that I think they should. But as I've said in my discussion, just like climate change and other issues that affect us all, the voice of the ordinary person and the moral imperative to fill the policy vacuum is what churches and religious groups may do best, because they may inform what the dignity of man requires, which is the trust to ensure that our society is more equal, more fair, but above all, more open and participative. Thank you.